This is lecture week 11, part 2, and in part 2 we're looking at chapter 2 in Professor Sachs' book, The End of Poverty. And in chapter 2, we first start out with the basic idea that there's a vast gap. There's a vast gap in wealth between the rich countries and the poor countries today. And so we delve into the question of how did this come about? How did it come about that we have such a vast gap or vast inequality between rich and poor countries today? And to get into that explanation, first, Professor Sachs looks at some of the history, so some basic demographics. First, in figure 1, he looks at world population. And so in terms of world population, Professor Sachs notes that as of 1820, we're at about 900 million people living in this world. The population has remained relatively stagnant. If we're taking from 1 AD to 1820 AD, we've gone from about a population of 230 million to about 900 million, which isn't that much, right? Which isn't that much of growth relative to what we see in the period of modern economic growth, which he's explaining as the last 200 years or so. But in this last 200 years, in the period of modern economic growth, Professor Sachs notes that world population has skyrocketed. It's increased sixfold during this time, during the modern period. And then he looks at some other demographics. We were introduced to figure 2, where he's looking at world wealth, and wealth as defined as average per capita income. So looking at average per capita income across the world, we see a similar trajectory, relatively stagnant world wealth as of 1820, or the period leading up to 1820. But, in the modern economic period, in the last 200 years or so, world wealth has skyrocketed at an even greater rate than world population. So world wealth has increased ninefold during this time. In the U.S., per capita income has increased 25-fold in the period of modern economic growth. In Western Europe, we see a 15-fold increase. So similar trajectories. Populations are increasing rapidly. World wealth is increasing rapidly. But then we're introduced to figure 3, and this is looking at GDP, or gross domestic product, the market value of what countries are producing within a given time period. So we're looking at GDP per capita by different regions, and Professor Sachs notes that in 1820, most of the world is poor at this time. Relative to today's standards, most countries are poor. We don't have this vast gap necessarily between rich and poor countries. The biggest gap that we see at that time, at 1820, is a ratio of 4 to 1 between rich countries and poor countries. But by 1998, by the turn of the next millennium, we're seeing vast inequalities. We're seeing a ratio of 20 to 1, a gap of 20 to 1 between rich countries and poor countries. That's between the U.S. and Africa. And so it begs the question of how did we get to that point? What explains the vast inequality that we saw or that we've seen in the period of modern economic growth? So at face value, if we look at the numbers, it's that the U.S. experienced different rates of growth relative to the poor countries. So in the U.S., we saw average rates of growth in the 1.7% range, but in Africa, we see growth rates of 0.7%. So there's that 1% average differential. While that 1% may not seem like much, Professor Sachs notes that 1% over time accumulates, and that leads us to that 20 to 1 ratio that we see today. He notes he's digging deeper. He's digging deeper in the chapter into how that inequality came about. And he says the key fact of modern times is not that we had a transfer of wealth from poor countries to rich countries, but that we had an increase in wealth worldwide. So all countries are getting richer, but some countries are getting richer faster than other countries. I've had many students over the years who don't necessarily agree with that idea that, in fact, there is some sort of a zero-sum struggle. But this is Professor Sachs' argument that we see an increase in world wealth internationally, and there's certainly evidence to bear that out, especially when we're looking at world wealth. Figure 2, we just noted that world wealth increased across all different regions. But of course, it's technology. So the bottom line, he notes, is that it's technology and not necessarily exploitation of the poor not the transfer of wealth from poor to rich countries that led to, or that contributed to, the vast gap between rich and poor countries today in terms of wealth. He notes that the UK was the first to experience rapid economic growth, and he discusses the reasons why Britain happened to be first. Britain had a number of different conditions that led them to experience modern economic growth before other countries. And so he discusses the different characteristics. Britain was a relatively open society, he notes. So innovation and creativity was encouraged and supported in the country. Britain also had a relatively stable political regime in place where liberties were protected. He also notes that Britain was one of the leading centers in terms of science. So there was a great scientific revolution in Britain at this time, and he gives us as an example Isaac Newton's book Principia Mathematica, representing the extent of the scientific revolution in that country. And he also notes geography. So geography played a tremendous role in why Britain experienced economic growth before other countries. Britain, because of the fact that it's an island economy, that allows for easy trade with other countries. Also, even within Britain, there are lots and lots of navigable rivers allowing for internal trade. Very fertile conditions, so lots of rainfall, allowing for productive agriculture. So different sort of geography-related factors. And then, of course, he notes that Britain was one of the first to be able to find ways to use coal. So coal, its use of coal, its use of modern fossil fuel technology or energy really contributed to Britain's experiencing modern economic growth before other countries. So he's talking about essentially the Industrial Revolution and that process as it occurred in Great Britain. And he's talking next about different social phenomena that often accompany the Industrial Revolution. And among those different phenomena, of course, we see urbanization. So if there are factories that are popping up in the inner cities and jobs are moving from sort of the rural areas to the cities, then certainly we should expect to see people flocking to the inner cities or urbanization. That's one of the social phenomena that we might expect to see. He also notes that we see greater social mobility. Where you have a farm-based economy, there's relatively little difference in sort of class standing or social strata. So families aren't that much different in terms of their class standing, but in an industry-based society, we see much more socialization, which we see much more social mobility, I should say. So there's much more room for people to move from one different class to the next. And we see different gender roles. So women in a farm-based economy, their traditional role is to stay home and take care of lots of kids, typically 5, 10, 15 kids. That was the trend that we saw in Great Britain. That's what Professor Sachs is arguing. But with industrialization, the type of industrialization that we're starting to see today in terms of countries like Bangladesh and in terms of India, where more and more women are working, we see a different gender role for women. So women are working more. They start to delay marriage. And the key demographic transition, Professor Sachs notes, is that there are lower fertility rates. So that's really the key demographic transition that's leading to this industrial revolution and in turn this modern economic growth that we see. And of course, he also notes greater division of labor. So in a farm-based economy, there's really not much division of labor. The person who farms the land also goes out and finds food, and the farmer or the head of household is typically engaged in lots of different activities, lots of different work-based activities. But in this new type of industry-based economy, we see much more specialization. So one person is taking a specialized role in terms of just maybe the company or the factory itself. So much more division of labor that we see. And then in the last part of the chapter, Professor Sachs talks about the diffusion or the spread of modern economic growth to other parts of the world from Great Britain. That's chapter 2 in a nutshell, and so we'll go ahead and move on to chapter 3 in the next part of this talk.